Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Trump gives a two to three week deadline on the war in Iran, should we have any reason to believe him. We also interviewed the likely next First Minister of Wales. That's Rhun Iorwerth, the leader of Plaid Cymru, of course. And has Donald Trump announced the end of the American world order, of US empire? I'm Michael Walker. I'll be discussing all of that tonight with Bastani. Great to have you in the studio.
Good evening, Michael. Mr. Michael Walker.
Mr. Michael, I like that.
Maybe you should change your Twitter handle to Mr. Michael Walker. So authoritative.
Esquire. Before we start the show tonight, a huge thank you to everyone who's filled in the Novara Media audience survey since we launched it yesterday. It's very important that we understand exactly who makes up the Novara Media audience. Make sure there's no wrong-uns among you. As Aaron said last night, we're preparing to take our biggest leap yet, and your feedback really will help us get to know exactly how we should do that, what we should be doing. We want to know who you are, what matters to you, and what you think we can be doing better. So please, can you let us know your thoughts in the comments? I know you're normally great at letting us know your thoughts in the comments, but this time we want to know via this survey. So I should have read this before we went live. If you fancy winning one of 5 £50 vouchers to spend in the Novara merch shop, complete it by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, the 12th of April, to be in with a chance of winning. We're going to keep mentioning it throughout the show tonight. Donald Trump has repeatedly said he doesn't want his war against Iran to become a never-ending quagmire like the war in Iraq, and which he said was run by stupid people. He's now given an idea of the timescale within which he plans to halt US attacks on Iran.
What happens in the Strait, we're not going to have anything to do with, because these countries, China will go up and they'll fuel up their beautiful ships and they'll leave and they'll take care of themselves. There's no reason for us to do it. We hit them hard. We got rid of a lot of the radicalized lunatics along the Strait. But if they want something, but I would say that within 2 weeks, maybe 3, we're hitting them very hard. Last night we knocked out tremendous amounts of missile-making facilities. As you probably read or wrote, we knocked out. Excuse me.
Pardon me for interrupting. The U.S. will be gone or done with the war in 2
I
or 3
think with
weeks?
2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
So he's saying 2 or 3 weeks. The Americans don't use the Strait of Hormuz anyway. It doesn't matter to them. Someone else should open it. He says that could be left to China. Later in the press conference, he suggested it could also be left to France. Maybe they could be the ones who reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And he said, this is significant. Well, if anything he says is significant, that the US withdrawal from the war will not require any kind of deal to be agreed with Iran.
No, they don't have to make a deal with me. When we feel that they are, for a long period of time, put into the Stone Ages and they won't be able to come up with a nuclear weapon, then we'll leave. Whether we have a deal or not, it's irrelevant. Now, it's possible that we'll have a deal because they want to make a deal. They want to make a deal more than I want to make a deal. But in a fairly short period of time, we'll be finished. They will not be able to do a nuclear weapon for years. And when they are ready, maybe in a long time from now, able to do a nuclear weapon, you'll have a president that will be like me in that he will go there and he'll knock the hell out of them again, because they cannot have a nuclear weapon. They are very radicalized people. They're very sick leaderships. And I will say, though, that the leadership we're dealing with now, with the new regime, because we have a new regime, and the new regime is much better than the past. Yeah.
So he mentioned that, Iran cannot become a nuclear power. He's very recently, so in the last 48 minutes, he's spoken to Reuters and told them that he actually doesn't care about the uranium either. So this is quoting him. That's so far underground, I don't care about that. He said in a Reuters interview, referring to Iran's stockpile of uranium. They say it's at odds with what he'd said before. They say he also says it can be monitored by spy satellites. So that's fine. Although I don't know how that's consistent with it being so far underground that it's not of concern. Aaron, I mean, this did sort of reassure the oil market for a while. Oil did go below $100 a barrel for a short period. It always goes back up again afterwards. Is there any reason to take this guy seriously when he says that this war is going to be over in 2 to 3 weeks?
So I think talk of the markets doesn't really mean very much. You now have overt statements coming from governments, the European Commission, about energy shortages, about refined petroleum, for instance. You have countries like India talking quite seriously about strategic reserves. You've got countries just today, like South Korea, Indonesia, saying we need to massively ramp up our renewables. I think it was Indonesia that said in the next 2 years, the Indonesian president, we need to increase our renewable base by 10 times in the next 2 years. The South Korean premier said something similar. We need to massively increase renewables. We need to completely electrify logistics and transport networks. All of this, by the way, is going to be Chinese technology. All of it. 9 out of every 10 solar panels on Earth, Michael, are made by the Chinese. Isn't that incredible? 9 out of every 10. 75% of all lithium-ion batteries worldwide are made by the Chinese. And you now have these enormous economies, South Korea, Pakistan, Indonesia, I could go on, India, Europe, who are going to look to rapidly decarbonize. Doesn't mean you get away from all oil and gas, or even coal for that matter, but you're going to try your damned hardest to not have this kind of shock again in the near future. There are some countries that learned the lesson of 2022, China being one of them, and they've actually managed to insulate themselves from the most negative downsides now. I think that's how these countries, Indonesia, South Korea, are looking at it. So when you have, Michael, this is the answer to your question. When you have Donald Trump saying this is over in 2 to 3 weeks, and then you have, on the other hand, the South Korean president saying, I can't sleep, we need to completely transform our grid to renewable energy, I kind of know who to listen to. One is making effectively a PR statement. One is articulating a challenge, which is effectively a national emergency. So there are 2 parallel realities going on here right now. And you're right, the markets are listening to Donald Trump. But I think fundamentally, the political, economic, and energy reality is actually more aligned with these panicky statements we're seeing from sleep-deprived politicians in the Pacific region, but also in Europe too.
Because obviously, that sounds like a very smart, wise thing for a political leader to be coming forward and saying this is a reason why we need to sort of double down on renewables and solar. Of course, when that happens, that would push down the price of oil because that means that sort of, demand would be lower. But in the short term, you have all of these political leaders saying, go down to a 4-day week. The Australian Prime Minister today said, use public transport more. It just does seem there's just a real dissonance between you having all these political leaders saying, literally, you need to stop using so much oil because we're going to need to ration it at some point. And then the traders being like, no, I really think Donald Trump probably will just end this in 2 to 3 weeks. And, because obviously if you think there's going to be a huge crunch in the future, you should buy the stuff because you think it's going to be really, really expensive down the line. But they seem to be taking the reassurances over and over again.
Well, first sort of point of a response to that is that oil is steadying and it's fallen a little bit, but it's still much higher than it was at the start of this conflict. I think in mid-February, it was about $65, $70 a barrel, $65 a barrel, $60 a barrel even actually, a bit earlier. And now it's generally about $100 a barrel. So it's gone up by around 50% and it's staying there, you're right. And one of the reasons why is because of these enormous strategic reserves that these countries have. China has enough petroleum in its strategic reserve, not held by private firms, of course they have more as well, but by the government, held by the government, I think for 3 months. Japan has enough petroleum for 200 days. So I think that's also part of it, Michael. There has been quite a lot of planning, particularly by the big Asian industrial economies. A few outliers there. India. India has a strategic reserve which will last it 7 days. Of course, there are private reservoirs of it too, but nothing like the preparation you see from South Korea, from Japan, from China. Energy-hungry economies, huge export-oriented manufacturing economies. They need lots of energy. They don't have any fossil fuels themselves. And I also think people are pricing in the fact that China is getting some energy from Iran still. And we're probably seeing Russia coming back on the scene as well. So it's not like a doomsday scenario, but you're right. Clearly, oil is being underpriced. And I do think that reflects really a cognitive bias, which is that, broadly speaking, things don't change too much. They might change a little bit, but they don't change too much. I think that's probably giving too much weight to the idea that Donald Trump is a quote-unquote normal politician.
So we've seen the statements from the American side. Let's go to the Iranian side, because Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke to Al Jazeera about the possibility of any negotiation. Let's take a look.
Our conditions for ending the war are clear. We do not accept a ceasefire. We are seeking an end to the war, not only in Iran but across the entire region. We seek guarantees that such aggressions will not be repeated, as well as the payment of compensation for the extent of the damages inflicted on us and on the people of Iran. At present, there is no ground for negotiation, and at present, there is no negotiation. Our position is clear, and at present, there is no ground for negotiation.
So that's the Foreign Minister, Arakchi, saying, no grounds for negotiation. Trump, as usual, sort of putting out a different message. So this was him on Truth Social today. Iran's new regime president, much less radicalized and far more intelligent than his predecessors, has just asked the United States of America for a ceasefire. We will consider when Hormuz Strait is open, free and clear. Until then, we are blasting Iran into oblivion, or as they say, back to the Stone Ages. Now, let's sort of move away from all the war crimes which are implied in blowing a country back into the Stone Age. Iran doesn't have a new president. So its president before this war was Masoud Pezeshkian, and its president now is Masoud Pezeshkian. So there is, Trump sort of saying there has been regime change. And when he's saying that, he's saying, well, we killed the leader and now they've been replaced. He keeps saying they've been replaced by someone more moderate. Most people who are experts on Iran say that when you kill these people, they're normally replaced by someone more hardline. But this guy is literally the same person. With the supreme leader, at least it was his son. He said it's regime change, it's now his son. He's saying this is regime change. It's the same president, Masoud Pezeshkian. So he hasn't changed. Also, he hasn't asked for a ceasefire. Pezeshkian hasn't, I don't think, commented since Donald Trump has tweeted this. He was, though, Donald Trump, I think, or, we can only guess, can't we? He was referencing on Tuesday, Pezeshkian telling the president of the European Council that Iran has the necessary will to end the war. So specifically, he said, quote, "We possess the necessary will to end this conflict, provided that essential conditions are met, especially the guarantees required to prevent repetition of the aggression." So it's not really asking for a ceasefire. As I say, a stretch to say this is all about someone asking for a ceasefire. And the new Speaker of Iran's parliament agrees. He's posted this. Out of context quotes plus manufactured FOMO equals war profiteering 101. Do your own research. Lots of people commenting, Donald Trump, obviously, like the president who is a real poster, like spends a lot of time on social media, speaks the language of social media. He's finally met his match, which is the new Speaker of Iran's parliament. Obviously, what he's saying here is that Trump is misleading the public about what Pezeshkian said. And what he's trying to do is sort of make people in the market sort of panic, thinking, oh, I'm going to miss out. Trump has said this. That means that the market's going to go up. Let's buy some shares. War profiteering does seem to be working, but that says more about the markets than it does, about the Iranian side. What do you make of this? Donald Trump he's looked at this headline from Pezeshkian. He hasn't realized that Pezeshkian is actually not a new president, that he must have just assumed that they also killed the president when they killed the supreme leader, and the chair of the National Security Council. This is crazy.
It is, and also, he is referencing Pezeshkian, but if you look at the figures who were there at the start and are still there, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf was the former mayor of Tehran, very senior person. He was the head of the police as well. Aragchi, you just mentioned, was already the foreign secretary, and Pezeshkian was the elected president. Not a particularly impressive figure, but nonetheless, he was there before. So you've had three figures there who've been there throughout. I mean, what I find particularly...
Ghalibaf had a different job, right? He wasn't Iran's Speaker of Parliament before.
Ghalibaf's had a range of jobs, but he's been in that sort of leadership cadre for a very long time. Like I say, he was the mayor of Tehran. He was very good on greening, believe it or not, LTNs and that whole agenda. Anyway, there's great footage of Ghalibaf in the Iranian Parliament leading chants of death to America, and now we're having to hear this nonsense that actually the people that are still there are the more moderate, more progressive people. But again, and I'm sure this is infuriating, Michael, for many people that watch and listen to the show. Why are we taking Trump seriously? Well, first part of the answer to that, we shouldn't. But the markets do ultimately listen to him, and that's ultimately where you're taking this. he hasn't the slightest idea what he's talking about. And I do think his incoherence on this does speak to something really important, Michael. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. The second Trump presidency, I think, on foreign policy, is effectively a color revolution in American politics. This is a course of action which has basically been pushed by a very small number of people, Benjamin Netanyahu, various think tanks, including the FDD at Washington, maybe Jared Kushner, maybe Pete Hegseth. But these are people that are overwhelmingly in the sphere of influence of the Israeli government. And I increasingly think that's how we should make sense of it. So if Trump is rambling from one position to the other, not making much sense, well, that's because the point isn't to make sense. He's executing a plan which is purely in the interests of Israel. There's that great meme of Benjamin Netanyahu saying, you know, if you're not willing to go in there, you're an anti-Semite. He's pointing to a bunch of coffins with the stars and stripes sort of, you know, hung over them. If there was some kind of ground invasion by the US military and the Israelis aren't involved, I mean, that must be, I can't think of a similar act of national cuckoldry on a par with that, which is to say America starts, enables, finances, fights Israel's war. And as that escalates, and actually there isn't an easy answer, and actually it lasts 48 hours and more, and then weeks, and then months, and then you actually get in there, still, you're not going to have IDF infantry involved. Like I say, keep this with you. That's how you make sense of it. This is a color revolution when it comes to US foreign policy.
I need to correct myself. You were right. Galibaf was Speaker of the Parliament before this war. He's been in the job since 2020. I thought he was one of the other people who was promoted when someone else was killed. But no, he has been in the same job this whole time. He has, though, only just come to prominence on X. So everyone he's constantly going viral. He's the star of X at the moment, this man, MB Galibaf. We'll just read a few more.
Mohamed Bagher, same as my father, first two names.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So he's clearly trying to speak to an American audience as well. So this is a post from yesterday. He's sharing a post from CNN about Americans cutting back on food to pay for fuel. He says, I just read about Sarah and others in the US skipping meals because gas prices keep climbing. Sad. But this is what happens when your leaders put others ahead of hardworking and ordinary Americans. It's not America first anymore. It's Israel first. This is also a picture, the next one. I got this wrong on Monday, so to correct myself, I said this was a bomber plane. It's actually much more significant. It's an E-3 Sentry airborne control and warning systems plane, sort of equipped with radar and the like. I mean, every plane has, but sort of it's to direct where other planes and missiles and stuff should go, worth between 300 and 500 million pounds. And then he's mocking the Americans who initially said it had sustained only minor damage, and with a bunch of emojis. This was his very viral tweet from Sunday. Heads up, pre-market so-called news or truth is often just a setup for profit-taking. Basically, it's a reverse indicator. Do the opposite. If they pump it, short it. If they dump it, go long. See something tomorrow. You know the drill. 15 million views. I can't remember if it was you that was sharing it with me. Someone was sharing this video of sort of Americans all thirsting over Arakchi, the foreign minister, saying how good he looks, how well he's dressed. The Iranians do seem to be having some success at sort of communicating to the American public in a way that I suppose you can't imagine during the Iraq war, say.
No, something really serious has changed, right? I think you'd be very bold to say it's a majority of American public opinion. No. But it's clearly a sizable minority of ordinary Americans who are interested in this stuff, are at least sympathetic to the Iranians, or they think it's a stupid war, or they outright like them, you know, and they're sort of cheering them on. Part of that is, you know, an aversion to Trump. Now, if you're a Trump supporter, you call that, oh, look, this is TDS, this is Trump derangement syndrome. Other people who are perhaps more skeptical of Trump's aptitude and ability as a president, they say, well, actually, no, this is quite well placed. But I do think in terms of the PR war, the Iranians are doing very well. And it's something I've thought about a lot, Michael. Generative AI is a game changer for middle-income powers in terms of doing quite effective social media, right? There was a funny video of Netanyahu and Trump with Baal, you know, saying, look, we've given you all these children. We're feeding you these children with the murder, the mass murder at Minab, of course, the school. And Baal is saying more, and then he's hit by an Iranian Shahab missile. And
who's Baal?
Baal is a satanic figure,
right,
in the Abrahamic faiths. Anyway, of course, some people might say it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory or whatever, but it's there in the Bible. And I think it's in the Quran as well. People can correct me. It's been about 25 years since I read the Quran. So generative AI and these social media networks have allowed them to run a much more sophisticated public relations operation than I think many people expected. But I also do think a lot of it just boils down to how dislikable the American side of the operation is. As much as you or I or our viewers and listeners might not like George W. Bush, you know, when he was playing golf and saying, now watch this drive, after I think he just announced a new escalation in the second Gulf War, now watch this drive, people think, well, this guy's a clown. He's an idiot, but okay, that's quite funny. You know, Trump, okay, still has those captivating flourishes, but Hegseth, not really. Jared Kushner, not really. Mark Dubovitz, a lot of these outriders, Mark Levine on X, they're very intensely dislikable and horrible people. Netanyahu, of course, Ben Gvir, Smotrich. So in that context, I think it's quite easy why at least 20, 30% of Americans who are interested in this stuff would say, actually, you know what, I quite like the cheeky Iranian dude with a nice smile.
I mean, it's also because, you know, even if people didn't like George W. Bush, sort of so much of the argument about the war on terror was that their systems are different. Not only are they illegitimate, but they're dangerous because they're unpredictable.
Yeah.
You know, it's just this one guy in control who might do mad things. In America, we have checks and balances. You know that America is not going to sort of randomly go to war with you because we've got Congress, we've got this 200-year history. Now people look at America and they think, okay, we're supposed to believe that the Iranians are the mad ones, right? When you've got this going on in your own country, which I just think means that those arguments that sort of capacity to other the side who you are bombing is just lower now because people have so little faith in their own country.
That's a great point. Iran is a constitutional system, okay? It's not a personalist regime. It's not like Saddam or Gaddafi. It's a constitutionalist system. There is a very sophisticated separation of powers and checks and balances. And there's a polyarchy. That was historically the big idea. There's a polyarchy. Power and influence rests in a whole bunch of different places, and they all counterbalance one another, which is what, you know, de Tocqueville talked about. It's what Montesquieu talked about. When you see the emergence of sort of liberal political philosophy and how you can have a democratic system, a popular republic that's able to govern itself, that's how you do things. Those are a set of ideas that actually the Iranians have adopted as well. I think that's a really great point. The fact that Iran isn't a personalist regime really does undermine a lot of the kind of the muscle memory and reflexive propaganda you get from the US.
Well, I mean, I meant more, because I think that is probably more complex than what most Americans understand, or most people in the world understand.
Well, you can't say it's one bad guy. Like, you can do it with
I meant
Saddam,
more
right?
the obvious degradation of the American political system. So
True.
America now looks like one bad guy, right?
Well,
No one's looking at America saying, well, you know, we might elect the odd bad president, but you can sort of trust that the Americans are a rational, sane, predictable country. They look like the most unpredictable country on earth now. And I think even most Americans recognize that.
Yeah, there's an inversion there, right? So historically, like you say, America has been the democratic republic against a personalist, autocratic regime, and there is some sort of inversion there. There is just this crazy old dude, he's going to be 80 in June, against clearly what is a regime, and I mean that in a positive sense. If one person goes, they'll be replaced by somebody else, which is often how we view our own systems. Clearly that's a challenge. And I do also think, Michael, this is a separate point I've thought about a lot. I do think that the first Gulf War, because of the timing, you know, that was at the sort of the peak at the end of history and American triumphalism. That is the prism through which much of the Western media, much of the Western political class, of course, most of them are over 50, that's how they understand these kinds of threats and challenges, you know. Saddam was this crazy guy that would have people taken out of a room and shot, and you could hear them being shot while he's puffing away on a cigar and a VHS. So that's also how the Iranians are. That's also how the Afghans are. That's also how the Pakistanis are. We're talking about, you know, countries and civilizations and cultures which are thousands of years old, hundreds of millions of people. Of course, they're very different.
There is about to be a political earthquake in Wales. In every election since the Welsh Parliament was created in 1999, Labour has been the largest party in the Senedd, and the nation has had a Labour First Minister. But the dominance goes even further back. In UK-wide elections, Labour has sent the most Welsh MPs to Westminster since 1922, so over a century. And that's all about to change. According to the latest MRP poll from YouGov, Labour will drop from 44 seats to 12 in May's Senedd elections. The big winners will be Reform, who would go from 0 seats to 30, and Plaid Cymru, who would become the largest party with 43 seats. That means Plaid's leader, Rhun Iorwerth, is favourite to be the Welsh First Minister. after May. He joined me and Aaron Bastani in the studio earlier today, and I asked him whether he was ready for that job.
The key thing, I think, is that there's been real consistency in the polls going back probably a year and a half or a little bit more now, and it tells a very consistent story. Plaid Cymru ahead in many of them, but Reform not that far behind, and it's that two-horse race, which I think is really gelling in people's minds now. It's the choice of two very, very different futures for Wales. Are we ready? Yeah, I mean, we are putting an awful lot of work into trying to win the election, but we have put an awful lot of work into making sure that we're ready to hit the ground running as well if the people of Wales put their trust in us.
And how would the sequencing work? So if you look at the SNP, they're the largest party in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
They then win a majority. They then have a referendum. Is that kind of how you guys see the pathway to a referendum for autonomy or independence for Wales panning out?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the main thing I think that I want to see happening in this election is for that historic change to happen. And it is massively significant. Where Labour's been winning elections for 100 years, they have done well over a century and more. But at some point, we need that break from the political monotony and lack of political renewal that comes from that. And that is the opportunity. Now, yes, I have a vision for the future of Wales. It's about building confidence right now, dealing with the things with the powers that we have right now. But I do want to, persuade the people of Wales, hopefully, to be more confident about what we can achieve. The timescale for what happens with that, I genuinely think it's in the hands of the people of Wales. I'll do what I can to guide them. I certainly don't believe this is as good as things get for Wales, but I need to persuade the people of Wales of that as well.
Are you less ambitious than the SNP then? Because it sounds to me like you want to be better administrators at the Senedd than the Labour Party, rather than actually offering a certain kind of national project in the same way that Alex Salmond wanted to.
I described it this week in launching our campaign as a mission. That this is a mission to transform Wales. That we can be better than this. The United Kingdom, it doesn't work for Wales as it is, and I have ambition unbounded in what we can achieve as a nation. But I'm also a pragmatic politician that I can't impose independence or anything on Wales. I have to persuade the people of Wales, and it's that passion that I will show, that the SNP showed in Scotland and continue to do so, that will hopefully make people confident in coming with us. But there's the reality of politics and the here and now, and things that we need to deal with on health and jobs and inequalities and poverty that we need to crack on with and show people, these Plaid Cymru guys, they know what they're doing. We'll trust them, and hopefully that trust can grow. But first of all, we've got to do it in this election.
I suppose, there'll be viewers from Wales. We'll ask you about sort of Welsh politics in one moment, but just sticking to this question of independence. So I was looking at, the dates when it came to the SNP. So they become the largest party in 2007.
Yeah.
In 2011, they win a majority. The referendum is in 2014, so it's all quite quick. You're about to become, if we believe the polls, the largest party. So if there's the same sequence, we could have an independence referendum in Wales by 2033. Is that something you see as plausible, or are you on a different track?
Of course it's plausible if we can persuade the people of Wales that is what they want to do. And what the SNP did in 2007 was to say that we will, from 2011, make the case to have the right to have a referendum. Because as it stands, we don't have that right. I mean, so unequal is this United Kingdom that we don't even have the powers to call a vote on our own future. Now, we make that case. We make the case for why we think that should happen. We make the case for the benefits that would come from that. We be honest about the challenges that come with that, so that the people of Wales hopefully will come with us. And goodness me, there's been a massive change in the last few years in the number of people who not only have said we are really confident in our ability to become an independent nation now, but more importantly, the people who are curious about it and say, we'd like it, not entirely convinced yet, so convince us. And I think that has been a massively significant shift in the past few years, and we've got a bit of work to do again. And I say this, independence means different things to different people as well, so we have to show what it is and what it isn't. I'm not an isolationist. I've no interest whatsoever in Wales closing itself away from the world. It's redesigning the relationship between the nations in these islands so we can work better together, all of us,
And has devolution worked for Wales up to this point? I mean, there's a democratic argument for it, obviously, but there are lots of areas of very significant social policy where the outcomes seem worse. So sort of education and health being the most obvious examples, where Wales is underperforming England, even though the funding is the same. So I mean, what's going on there? Presumably that's not going to give Welsh people like lots of confidence in independence.
I mean, devolution in itself is a principle that decisions should be taken, I believe, as close to the people that those decisions affect. And I believe in that Wales is a nation, and that the normal state of a nation is to be able to design and influence its own future. But you're right, it has to also then be a means to do things and to do things better. Do I believe Welsh Government, using the tools that we currently have through devolution, have been making best use of those tools? Well, no. I'm a leader of a party that has been in opposition for all of that 27 years, apart from as a junior party in government nearly 20 years ago, now in a coalition. I don't think government has made the best of what it has got at its disposal, and we're putting a programme for government to try to do things better.
What's your analysis of what went wrong on a policy perspective? And I suppose especially I'm thinking of education, where Wales has gone down sort of in the PISA rankings. It is really underperforming England, especially when it comes to the least privileged children. And I suppose I want to know, what's your critique? What did the Labour administration in Wales get wrong, and what would you do differently?
On education, I think more than anything, it took its eye off the ball. We have a hugely proud record in education in Wales, one of the first nations in the world to have a generally literate population. We were ahead of the game many, many years ago, and we've let slip. And much of that, I think, has been in government not focusing on what needs to be doing. And going into this election, we want to strip it back to those basics of numeracy and literacy, preparing our young people to have those basic things that they need to flourish in life. But we can look at a host of other areas as well. On health, for example, the lack of regeneration of ideas is one of the big problems that we have. A government that is in power so long becomes risk averse, I think. You need new energy, new ideas coming in every now and then, with that sort of rhythm of politics that allows you to change direction. And one of the principles that we're putting in place in trying to govern in a different way is to put what we call a test and learn model in place, where we try things, and if they don't work, we change direction. And what we see all too often is a stagnation in the delivery. Well, only in those terms we need that change in this election, but it comes from ideas as well.
And the argument that's often made, I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies said this about the Welsh education system, is that they sort of tried to move away from testing because sort of they thought they wanted a more comfortable, I suppose, education system, and the IFS thinks it's backfired. So would you sort of be reintroducing more testing, more targets into the system?
I think what we do need to be willing to do is to do what we feel is right for education, and moving away from any testing or any way of measuring progress clearly doesn't work. And I'm not interested in league tables of schools. I don't think that works. But do we need better ways of measuring progress? Absolutely we do. And progress for the child as well as progress for a school, for example.
And on devolution, if you look at Cardiff, you look at that part of the UK, very densely populated part of the world, you can imagine a very big, larger metropolitan area.
Yeah.
There's an argument that is actually, well, you'd have much more effective government for Cardiff and the environs around it if it had a metro mayor, rather than this national administration, which has to cover actually very different parts of Wales, North Wales, which is very different to the needs of Cardiff. That debate around metro mayors is obviously on steroids in this country because we've just created a bunch of them in England. What do you think about that critique of devolution in Wales, but also Scotland, where you didn't have the metro mayors, you couldn't have the kinds of urban renewal, which increasingly we associate with places like Manchester?
Yeah, and it's been very impressive what has been done in those areas, and it's very, very important that we have effective structures in Wales's urban areas. When you look at the Cardiff Capital Region organisation working alongside a Cardiff Council, there is a lot that they can do in terms of local administration. But one of the things I think that works well for Wales, potentially, is our scale. And yes, it would be a scale that is made up of a mix of urban and rural, but we are of a size where you can make things work across sort of all of our geographic area. We're a population of around 3 million people. It's the kind of size of population where you can find a way of doing things and making sure you replicate that right across the health system or the education system. And I don't think the fact that it's a mix of urban and rural in itself should hold us back. Leadership can come in many forms, and I want a Plaid Cymru government that if I were to be the First Minister leading it, to have a really good proactive relationship with those more local areas, including Cardiff Council.
Who would your favoured allies be? I mean, right now, if the MRP poll from YouGov, I think it is to be believed, it's suggesting that you and Labour would be the combination with the most members of the Senate, and then it would be you and the Greens. Both plausibly could be a majority. Who would be the preferred candidate?
Yeah, and one, I believe in cooperation. Cooperation is really important. I think people expect it. We have a system that has never delivered a majority government, and that we've changed it for this election. And again, the expectation is that there won't be a majority government. But that's normal when you look across so many European countries. I think with devolution still being relatively young, 27 years old, people aren't quite maybe still in that place where they accept, no, there has to be cooperation. And the right in politics will accuse us of having propped up Labour over the years. Well, it's not propping, it's using influence. What I want to have is a situation where ideally we run a minority government, but that other parties feel able to influence us, and where we reach out to them and say, okay, where is the common ground between us? What can we work on in terms of legislation, in terms of budgets? What is it that we agree on, and that by bringing our forces together, we can be greater than the sum of the parts, and we'll look across a number of parties and see, okay, let's do this, and bring stability to the people of Wales in that way. But with others able to contribute their ideas and, crucially, votes.
And I think late last year you said, in New York it's Mamdani, in Wales it's Plaid. So are you the Welsh Mamdani, and why?
I made it explicit in that election, in that interview, that I didn't say I was a Welsh version of Mamdani, because that's not the point. The point is that I felt energised from Wales looking at what was happening in New York. And a lot of people currently are looking for that kind of hope, because that's what Mamdani stood for. He stood for hope, a different way of doing things, a self-belief in what collectively we can do. We saw it in the by-election in Caerphilly in Wales, where people said, you know what, we believe in what Plaid Cymru stand for in this election and their vision. We also want to keep out the far right, because that is not hope. That's division. We want that hope. And I think Plaid Cymru very much carries that mantle in Welsh politics currently, and surely like-minded people, whether we're in New York or Newborough in my constituency, that sense of, let's learn from each other and Newport, take energy from each other. I could have lots of news. We have several Newports. Yeah. I went for one in my own patch.
For at least a century, the United States has been the world's preeminent military power. Since 1945, it has stood at the head of a world system created in its own image and designed with its interests in mind. And of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, that power was uncontested. But the era of American leadership, or American empire, whichever descriptor you prefer, is drawing to a close. One reason for that end is the rise of China. The other is this guy.
We have nothing to do with that. What happens in the Strait, we're not going to have anything to do with, because these countries, China will go up and they'll fuel up their beautiful ships and they'll leave and they'll take care of themselves. There's no reason for us to do it. Look, problem with the Strait, a guy can take a mine, drop it in the water, and say, oh, it's unsafe. It's not like you're taking out an army or you're taking out a country, or they can drop it. Or you can take a machine gun from the shore and shoot a few bullets at a ship, or maybe an over-the-shoulder missile, small missiles. That's not for us. That'll be for France. That'll be for whoever's using the Strait.
So that was Donald Trump saying that it's not the USA's job to provide safe passage for ships in the Strait of Hormuz, even though they started the war that closed it, and that other countries should sort it out themselves. And it was a repeat of this advice that he tweeted out earlier on Tuesday. This time he was singling out the United Kingdom, he said there that if the UK wanted oil, they should just, quote, go to the Strait and take it. And he said, you'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore. So why, you may ask, does this specifically signal the end of American empire? That little clip I showed you and that little Truth Social post from the president. Well, this tweet from Cornell historian Nicholas Mulder gives a clue. So he says, hegemony in Kindleberger's sense of leadership plus global public good provision ends once you abandon the preservation of global open sea lanes, the minimum commitment of liberal maritime power since 1815. So to translate, Kindleberger, he's an economic historian, came up with the hegemonic stability theories. This is the idea that when you have one dominant power, the world order is more stable. So the hegemon might use that power to enhance their own interests, of course, they're not going to be benevolent, but so long as they provide stability and public goods, it might be in everyone else's interests to go along with it. And Nicholas Mulder is pointing out that in the British Empire and the period of American hegemony, a key public good, maybe the preeminent one, that the leading power provided was the preservation of open sea lanes, so enabling international trade. So you might lose a bit of sovereignty because you've got this hegemon that has the ultimate power, but they're providing this public good, which is that you're not going to have piracy, that you're going to be able to trade safely throughout the world. And what you've seen there in that clip from Donald Trump and in his Truth Social post is Trump is not only admitting the US can't provide that, but also that they're actively undermining the ability of commercial ships to have safe passage. Aaron, in this segment, we're going to go through a few indications of the decline of American empire or the end of American empire and how sort of Donald Trump is announcing it. But I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, we discussed this a bit with Mark Carney when he was saying we were happy to go along with sort of American hypocrisy when they were still providing public goods that we could benefit from. He was angry about the Greenland issue and Donald Trump using the global trade system to punish people with tariffs. Now the fact that the empire is specifically interrupting international trade and global safe passage through the seas, that is kind of the definition of it's no longer the hegemon that people can rely on.
I think so. I mean, we refer to it as the Pax Americana, which has really existed since 1945, the American peace. Another way of saying, America has been this unipolar hegemon, undoubtedly since the end of the Cold War, but I think really you can say since 1945 we've lived in a Pax Americana. The point of the Pax Americana wasn't that the whole world was at peace. If you lived in quite large parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia or east of the Berlin Wall, you wouldn't say, well, it was a wonderful Pax Americana. But for the rest of us, it was quite nice. But as Carney hinted at with that speech, that's kind of going now. And emblematic of that is the presence of US military bases. These are meant to make your country more safe, not less safe. And the experience of countries like Qatar and Bahrain and the UAE in the last month has been the complete opposite. They've become targets precisely because they're home to US bases. They haven't protected those places. They've made them actually more vulnerable. They've been a source of exposure rather than security. Those are the first 2 points. Thirdly, Trump said that, look, China's getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz. They can do it. Why can't France and the UK? China is getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz because it's Iranian oil, right? They're buying Iranian oil. There's now Iranian oil that's also going to be going to India for about $100 a barrel. So if his quote-unquote solution here is that Britain and France buy Iranian oil, thereby ending sanctions on Iranian oil, if that's the solution, I don't think anybody really saw that one coming. The incoherence of Trump, though, I think is really secondary to the point you're making, which is that America is no longer a guarantor of international trade. And that quintessential kind of idea of comparative advantage, David Ricardo, one place can produce more of this and another can produce more of that, and it's of net benefit to everyone because the factors of production are more efficient. So Portugal can sell port and Britain can sell wool, and that makes sense for them to focus on that and them to focus on that. The core presumption of comparative advantage is that the costs of trade and transit and logistics are very low. They're close to zero, which is broadly true, by the way, nowadays with containerization and whatnot. What's changing, though, with the potential collapse of American hegemony and the demise of safe shipping lanes, is that those costs are going up. A very, very important moment. And I think it does pull the veil back a bit, it was almost left coded to say for a very long time that globalization is really a reflection of American empire. They're the same thing, Of course, some neocons would overtly say that, but liberals wouldn't really say that kind of thing. It was left to the radical left and the radical right. I think what Trump is doing is really just exposing that to be undoubtedly true.
Well, exposing it and ending it, right? Because I suppose there's two arguments one can make about sort of American global leadership, which is, you can have this sort of liberal idea, which is there isn't actually an American empire. We're all sovereign nations making contracts with each other, and it's all sort of governed by law, and we've moved beyond empire. Or you can say there's American empire and it has to be destroyed because empire is bad. Or you can say there's American empire. It's not perfect, but it has provided many countries in the world with the security and the predictability that they are able to develop. And I mean, talking of, obviously, America's actions in Southeast Asia in much of the 20th century were a complete disgrace. But if you look at the polling in Vietnam, Vietnamese people, very pro-America, very anti-China. So the Pax Americana, as it's been called, its popularity hasn't just been combined. When you talk about this, people say, well, yeah, it was fine for Europe. For the rest of the world, it was a disaster.
Well, Pax Americana is very popular in Vietnam now because they've been, I think, the world's even outperforming China in terms of annual growth. They've been the world's best exporter for about 25 years. So it's been very good for them recently. I mean, I'm sure if you ask Vietnamese, 3 million Vietnamese died, right?
If you ask
Vietnamese in the 80s or the 70s, you'd get a very different answer. You're right, though. In that part of the world, the place that has the most antipathy to America still is obviously China and North Korea.
Talking about trade, you mentioned military bases. Let's go on to military bases because in the British Empire, they had military bases everywhere, but it's formal colonialism. Right? You didn't ask the country. American Empire, the idea has generally been that you get consent from the government, whether or not they're democratic, and it's based on this quid pro quo, which is the Americans put their bases in your country, and then you get the protection of the Americans, the preeminent military power. Obviously, throughout the 20th century, core element of this was NATO, specifically for Europe. Trump has now all but ended that, though. So Trump today told The Telegraph that he is strongly considering pulling out of NATO. Asked if he might leave NATO by The Telegraph, he said, quote, "Oh yes, I would say it's beyond reconsideration. I was never swayed by NATO. I always knew they were a paper tiger, and Putin knows that too, by the way." Secretary of State Marco Rubio was slightly more diplomatic on Fox News.
I've been one of the strongest defenders of NATO during my time as a United States Senator because I found great value in it. And it wasn't just about defending Europe. I said it also allowed us to have military bases in Europe that allowed us to project power into different parts of the world when our national security was threatened. If now we have reached a point where the NATO alliance means that we can't use those bases, that in fact, that we can no longer use those bases to defend America's interests, then NATO is a one-way street. Then NATO is simply about us having troops in Europe to defend Europe. But when we need their help, not their help, we're not asking them to conduct airstrikes. When we need them to allow us to use their military bases, their answer is no. Then why are we in NATO? You have to ask that question. Why do we have billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, over the years, trillions of dollars, and all these American forces stationed in the region? If we can only use, in our time of need, we're not going to be allowed to use those bases.
He's very pissed off because not all of America's, lots of countries are not allowing America to use their bases in them. Obviously, we didn't let them use Diego Garcia until they started the war because then afterwards we reclassified it as defensive, a bit strange. France, Italy and Spain have now all refused to one extent or another. I think some of them, allowing it with restrictions. They've all refused to allow the US military to even use their airspace. So that's what has pissed off the Americans. Of course, the difference is that Marco Rubio there is saying that we need them, and everyone's like, well, this was a war of choice, and also we don't really trust the Americans to help us in our time of need anyway, given that Donald Trump is president. Keir Starmer has still, though, said that NATO is essential, although with some qualifications. When asked about Trump saying he might leave the alliance, Keir Starmer said this.
Let me say a number of things in response to that. Firstly, NATO is the single most effective military alliance the world has ever seen. And it has kept us safe for many decades, and we are fully committed to NATO. Secondly, that whatever the pressure on me and others, whatever the noise, I'm going to act in the British national interest in all the decisions that I make. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that this is not our war, and we're not going to get dragged into it. But I'm equally clear that when it comes to defence and security and our economic future, we have to have closer ties with Europe. That's why we had the summit last year. This year, as I've just announced, there'll be a further summit. We will make good on the commitments that we put in place last year, but we will also go further in relation to the alignment.
I thought that was actually quite a good answer from Starmer. So he's saying, we're 100%, this is not our war, we're not going to get involved. We are going to move closer to Europe. I mean, sort of saying there's going to be a summit in the summer is a bit vague. What does that mean? But sort of what
we can have a Zoom call.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Keir.
I mean, the message he's trying to give is that we have decided we want to move closer to Europe. I suppose sticking to NATO, do you agree with Keir Starmer that NATO has been the most effective military alliance the world has ever seen?
Well, first off, we are involved. We've been allowing the US to use our bases. We are involved. You know, he posted a video onto his TikTok account about planes and helicopters and Chinooks and aircraft carriers, and I think there was some Top Gun style music, and he's now realised that's gone down like a shit sandwich, and he's done what they call the reverse double ferret. So they yoinked the video, and it's like it never happened kind of thing, which is probably wise, because it's a deeply unpopular war. Donald Trump is deeply unpopular. He's only got favourable ratings from 18% of the British public. It's his war. It's an unnecessary war. In terms of NATO and its success, I think this is a classic case of robo-Starmer. You know, he's saying the establishment orthodoxy. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think he's saying it because he's just heard it so many times. I don't think he's actually examined that. Britain has had an unprecedented period of safety, okay, since 1945 in terms of, you know, the island of Britain from foreign enemies. You know, you can talk about Bloody Sunday in Ireland, you can talk about being embroiled in Iraq and whatnot, but clearly these are different kinds of conflict to the First and Second World Wars, Crimea, etc., etc., etc. We've not been involved in conventional wars in Europe. We've not been involved in a war of national self-defense since World War II. He's saying that's because of NATO. Why do we have nukes? If it's all because of NATO, why do we have nukes? If this alliance is the reason why we've not had a conventional war in Europe, why do we have nukes? I'm of the mind it's actually because of the nuclear weapons. Right? I think that's a much more sensible explanation as to why you don't get hot conventional war between Western Europe and the Americans and, of course, the Soviet Union before the end of the Cold War. That's the fundamental reason. Now, you could say that's wrapped up with NATO, but I think that's the fundamental reason. It's probably my most sort of right-wing opinion, okay, as actually mutually assured destruction to some extent is true. Clearly, though, if you're just looking back at history, it's correct, isn't it, that for Western Europe, it's been a pretty safe, peaceful time in history, and that correlates with NATO. The question is that a sensible basis upon which to act going forward? I think it isn't. I think, in the words of one French politician, we shouldn't be outsourcing the security of Europe to a swing voter in Wisconsin every 4 years. I think that's madness. And it's also very important to say that Trump isn't the end of this. This is the future of the Republican Party that's at stake. So yes, Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, they're not as crazy or as unpredictable as Donald Trump, but they're having to appeal to the same political constituencies internally. So the idea that they're going to return to some sort of predictable orthodoxy that in any way resembles this very successful alliance that we've had, I think is unlikely. Secondly, it is really sad that NATO demurred from its historical mission, which was the North Atlantic. It was about protecting safety and security in the North Atlantic. Very much an instrument of Cold War defense policy. It was about European defense, Western European defense against the Warsaw Pact, even though actually the Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO, not the other way around. Obviously, that's now gone. So you have, after the end of the Cold War, an organisation in search of a purpose. What do? Afghanistan. Okay, America was attacked, the only country so far that's triggered Article 5, but it's not in the North Atlantic. What do? They do Libya. I mean, we don't have a map right now, but Libya's quite a long way away from the North Atlantic. I don't think anybody would sensibly say it was a matter of European defence. So you had mission creep with NATO because it was an organisation in search of a purpose. And I think the reality is, Michael, that once the Cold War was over, you probably needed to move beyond it. That doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have forms of collective security. I think it probably does need that. I think that's what Keir Starmer is kind of edging towards. But I don't really understand why that's got to be imbricated with the United States. You know, the European Union and Britain is, you know, a landmass of the best part of 500 million people, $12, $13 trillion economy, a ton of G7 economies. They should be able to look after themselves. I mean, that's the one thing that Trump says, which I think he's right about.
I suppose, so to clarify the nuclear point, so there's an argument, it's been a very sort of peaceful time in Europe historically since the formation of NATO. You're saying it's more because there are nuclear weapons around, which just mean that big powers don't go to war with each other anymore because of mutually assured destruction. So the argument that NATO would have been relevant would have been less for Britain and more for those European countries that don't have a nuke.
That's very fair. That's very fair. And also, in the world we are today, this question about NATO, it's much more heated, and I think understandably so for a country like Poland than Britain. Ireland isn't in NATO, partly because it doesn't really need to be. It's a long way away from Russia. So that's a very fair point. But, there are lots of these multilateral bodies all over the world, and those places have still had war. I think that basis of mutually assured destruction is a big one. Look at India, Pakistan. They've not had a hot war for a long time for a reason. I think there's a really credible argument about if Iran had a nuke. I'm not suggesting it should or it shouldn't, but if Iran had a nuke, one school of thinking, and I don't think they would use it against Israel, I think it would constrain the actions of Tel Aviv quite significantly. I think that's probably true. You certainly wouldn't see this conventional war we're now seeing. That wouldn't be happening if Iran had a nuke because of mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and I mean, military alliances didn't stop the First World War, did they? So
No.
It does seem like what was different was the nuclear weapon. If American empire is over, what will take its place? Well, in the FT this week, friend of the show, Adam Tooze, has written a blueprint for Chinese global leadership. So in the piece, he says this: "It is a truism of the moment that China is the last adult in the room. If Beijing chose to play the part, global leadership would be there for the taking. If you were drafting a 5-point plan for Chinese hegemony at a think tank in Beijing, it might look like this." This is what I love about Adam Tooze. He's sort of confident enough to write a 5-point plan for Chinese hegemony in the Financial Times. Anyway, these are his 5 points. So he says, start by offering to backstop multilateral efforts to provide short-term balance of payment support to countries facing financing issues. And with its huge trade surplus, Beijing has dollars aplenty. That's basically replacing the role of the IMF, isn't it, which is an American-led institution. He says China could then make a gesture of sharing its privileged status in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's not by accident that tankers are rumoured to have been rebadging themselves as Chinese. Now, you can imagine how popular this would be with many countries in the world. Donald Trump is saying, you go and reopen the Strait of Hormuz yourself, right? He's saying, I've prompted this situation where there are sort of drones blowing up these tankers, but you need to go now and you need to kill the drone operators. Adam Tooze is saying, what if the Chinese said, well, we actually can get our ships through and we will help share some of that oil with you? That would, I mean, the Europeans would love that. He then says, Beijing could also offer to contribute some fraction of its huge petroleum reserve to a global oil stability pool. It might offer to do this in cooperation with big suppliers like the Saudis, Malaysians, and Brazilians, sort of similar to the last point, sort of helping with the oil crunch. And he says, at the same time, Beijing should band together with a coalition of the willing to launch a comprehensive global green investment push, boosting demand for its green industries. Europe would find this hard to resist, but everyone, even the Saudis and Emiratis, are interested in China's clean electro-tech. The sharp distinction between petrostates and electrostates exists mainly in the minds of fossil fuel ideologues, not for those interested in cheap, clean power. So it says, you could maybe sort of relate that to the Marshall Plan. So it's this idea that you could have this Chinese investment, which is based on exporting their technology, which is much like the Marshall Plan. And then finally, and most ambitiously, China could declare that in the interests of global stability, there must be immediate ceasefire negotiations in both Ukraine and the Gulf. Until those talks begin, it is no longer in China's interest to export critical supplies to combatants in either region. This would exert pressure both on Moscow and Washington. Without Chinese rare earths, the US and Israel cannot continue their missile war for long. Aaron, so he's basically saying, the Chinese would provide these public goods of financial stability, of stability when it comes to energy supplies, and then also sort of become some sort of global policeman, even though a less militaristic version than the United States. Are you ready for Adam Tooze's vision of Chinese leadership?
Well, it's not often you read a sort of geopolitical fanfic in the Financial Times, which is kind of what this is. Doesn't mean the ideas are bad necessarily. The idea of a shared petroleum reserve, I don't know why they would do that necessarily. I mean, this huge reserve for China allows it to do something really important, Michael, in the present circumstances, which is it allows Beijing and the government to guarantee low prices for their manufacturers. If you're a manufacturer in Germany or in Vietnam or France and your energy prices go up, of course, your sales price goes up as well, right? You have inflation on your side, on the supply side. So, of course, you pass that on to the final consumer. This then confers another advantage onto Chinese exporters, right? They can keep their prices the same because the government is guaranteeing a steady supply of petroleum because of this huge 3-month reserve they have. So I don't think they would do that necessarily. On the point about should band together with a coalition of the willing to launch a comprehensive global green investment push. Why does it need to do this? It's already doing it, Michael. Amazing report out today. 49% now of all electricity globally is from renewables. I think that's 4 or 5%. So it's almost over half. By next year, we're going to be over 50% of all electricity worldwide will be from renewables. Solar capacity last year grew worldwide by 511 gigawatts. So solar grew by 511 gigawatts. I say 49% of electricity is from renewables. Most of that 49% is from solar, the overwhelming majority. So solar grew by 511 gigawatts. Fossil fuel capacity grew by 116 gigawatts. Of course, if you're Richard Tice or Nigel Farage, you don't believe this. It's nonsense. It's woke nonsense. But solar outperformed fossil fuel as a source for electrical generation by a factor of 4 last year, right? So this is already happening. 9 in every 10 solar cells in the world are Chinese. Anywhere in the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Britain, Bolivia, Australia, they're Chinese solar cells. The lithium-ion batteries, 75% of those are Chinese. The cobalt, the diode on the lithium-ion battery, I think 75% of that is processed in China. The tantalum that you get in the capacitors, almost all of it's processed in China. So across the entire supply chain for these really critical technologies, batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, and others too, 5G, but we're talking really about the clean tech stuff. Across the entire commodity chain, China has it sorted. And the numbers are exploding. There was that amazing data point from a few days ago that the combined value of Chinese battery firms had increased by about $70 billion in just a couple of weeks. So I don't really understand why, given those numbers I just said, solar capacity grew by 511 gigawatts, fossil fuel capacity by 116. Why do you need a coalition of the willing, comprehensive global? It just sounds like, white shirt, tie, pencil necks, G7 meetings. The Chinese aren't doing that. They are industrialists producing clean energy at huge scale, very cheaply, just getting on with it. So why do they need to do that would be my question, Michael.
Okay, it seems to me like you're making more the argument, which is on the front of The Economist magazine this week. We can bring this up. Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. It's great front page. You can see Donald Trump there and she looking happy in the background. I do tend to agree that you need to flesh out more why this is in China's interest. I suppose the best attempt I can make at saying why a move like this would make sense for the Chinese is the possibility, and maybe it's a slim possibility, that American governance gets more competent in the future. Because I think there is an argument that Joe Biden was actually putting real pressure on China. So he was genuinely sort of restricting certain key goods, so the highest level chips. Obviously, then China sort of was driven to innovate its own, but clearly that was putting some pressure on them, some strain on them. It was also forming, alliances with other countries that were putting China under threat. There was a serious chance that the Americans were going to be able to encircle China to some degree, not overthrow the CCP, but at least slow down its advance. Now, obviously, under Trump, that's all gone. There is no way that sort of an America as chaotic as it is under Trump can slow down China's advance. But maybe China would sort of take this short-term cost so that it could build the kind of international networks and infrastructure that would mean that a more competent future American White House could not recreate what Joe Biden did. That would be my best argument for why, even though in their short-term interest, there's no need for them to do any of this. It might make us, if this is America at its weakest, which is big if, then now would be the time to build those China-led institutions.
Trump said something, again, accurate, which is that actually rare earth metals aren't that rare. It's about the processing. So I think China is home to about 70% of known deposits of rare earth metals, but you can find them elsewhere. But it basically has a monopoly on the processing part. And the processing is really important. Cobalt is another example. Cobalt for a very long time was a waste product. It's only really with renewable technologies that has this value. And the processing, which is very expensive, very energy demanding, etc. They have that monopoly on it. So For the Americans, you have this really important material, rare earth minerals, which, by the way, F-35s need them. And they have said publicly, I think it was on Business Insider, they only have a supply of about 2 to 3 months of rare earth minerals. This could be circumvented by just having a domestic processing capability. They don't have it, right? So something as simple as that, I think that really gets to the heart of the dysfunction of American politics. That's the first thing. If there was a problem in China, they would just sort it out, okay? And that's not happening in America. And in terms of America's ability to compete with China on cost with these technologies, it just doesn't exist. Michael, BYD now stands for Build Your Dreams, the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer by sales. And actually, is it more valuable than Tesla? Probably not. But it's by sales. It's a big company. It's up there now with some of the biggest car companies. Although of course it's still behind the biggest ones like Toyota and whatnot. How many people are in their research and development team?
BYD's research and development team.
Yeah, which don't make just cars. To be clear, they're also a huge battery producer.
10,000.
100,000 people.
Wow.
You can't compete with that scale, right? 100,000 people. Every year, China has, for now, the demographics aren't very good. That's going to deteriorate over time. But for now, China has about 1.2 million engineers every year. Of course, they have people retiring as well. But every year, they have 1.2 million engineers entering the labor market. 1.2 million. Do you know how many America has?
100,000.
120,000. So, and that's not bad, right? America's population is significantly smaller than China. But China is much bigger by population, but also per capita, it's producing more engineers. So you have so many more engineers, you have such a bigger market, America just can't compete. The scale it's too much. I think the talent pool, the scale of the market, and the clearly excellent leadership that the CCP has had with regards to these technologies, it's just a fact. They've just left America in the dust. Now, can America be on the ascendant again in 30, 40 years' time? Of course it can. There's nothing unique or special about China and its government and so on. They would have to make a series of good decisions. That's presently not happening. Let me give you one more example. At the start of this conflict with the Iran war, we heard this claim that this was all 5D chess, right? They're taking out Iranian oil from the Chinese supply, even though Iranian oil is only about 12% of Chinese supply, which is a lot, but it's not 50%. They're taking out Venezuela, they're taking out China, and it's a new great game to deprive China of really important fossil fuels. Okay. At the same time, China, basically 25 years ago, secured 50% of the supply of cobalt in Congo. The Americans are nowhere on that stuff. So it's like the Americans are playing Connect 4. They think they're playing chess, and the Chinese are playing chess. I think that's an outgrowth of a set of ideological presumptions, really, which was leave it to the market. The state can't help private enterprise meet certain objectives and needs and challenges. We're always going to be number one. And I think, look, yeah, of course, America can turn that around, but it's going to take a very long time. So the idea that it's going to happen in 1 or 2 administrations, I don't buy. And I think, finally, the American system is so built towards adversarialism, I don't think they can build a consensus, actually, to meet these challenges.
Yeah, well, it's strange, because they used to have, whether or not you like them, they did used to have bipartisan consensuses on like international policy. But there is something about populism and polarization, which means that like the American system just cannot function and cannot have policy that lasts more than like 2 years, really, because even if you get a new president, then you have your midterms. So there is something about the combination of modern technology, I think, and maybe sort of demographic structure and America's form of adversarial democracy that just means that it cannot have long-term policy, which does mean buy shares in China, not the United States.
Buy BYD. It's bad, Michael, when I live in Portsmouth, and you're in Portsmouth and you see a big, JQ, and all their JQ cars are outside and they look like brand new Land Rovers. They're a quarter of the price of a Jaguar Land Rover. People are going to buy the JQ.
What's the JQ? This is like
the
a
new
BYD.
new Chinese EV, 4x4.
Fabulous. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael.
Thank you for tuning in tonight. Another reminder, I'm going to get it right this time. Do fill in the audience survey. If you haven't yet, just go to Novara Media, Novara.media/survey. I knew it was too much to ask, to fill it in. Let's wrap up there. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.